a couple of years ago, I was looking for a way to support the amazing ideas that the faculty had. And they can look for grant funding from the university at only specific times of the year and only for certain kinds of work. But what we wanted was, I wanted a more continuous type funding. So when the idea came, when the project came up, when they had an idea to do something with you, we would be able to fund it. And so we now do that for curricular work, for scholarly work, for work with community partners, for research with students, for travel to conferences, any one of these things. Typically, when you get a university grant, at the end of the year, after the project has happened, you have to write a report. And the report goes to your department chair, to your dean, and to the provost. And I thought, well, that's not going to reach a lot of you. That's not going to change our lives in the way that I think this work that you're doing together will change lives. So I asked the provost if for us, our faculty could present at these type of symposiums to one another so they could learn from each other what they were doing, how they got the funding, how the project went, what had happened. And it has grown to the fact that we want you to be here, our students as well, because now we're doing these kinds of things with you. So you may be in here because you've done something with a faculty member, because you're doing something with a faculty member, or tonight these informal conversations may inspire you. At any rate, remember that when you're in the College of Public Service and you are criminal justice, social work, urban education, you too are innovators and you too are here to change lives. Yeah. Let's get started. I think a couple of people have class tonight, so they've decided the order. I'm just asking who gets the mic. All right. Yes.
So one of the things that happens in Department of Urban Ed that I really like, and that I think we really like, is that we spend a lot of time talking to each other, sometimes in our offices when we're together, sometimes when we do conferences, but there's a lot of collaboration that goes on, and we will talk about things that we have in common, and we will talk about projects we want to work on. And so Dr. Sack and I have talked about a project that we've been interested in doing together, or that we've been interested in for a long time. And we started thinking about how we could actually put this together. And we actually went to Dr. Van Horn's office and said, hey, we have an idea. And it became into fruition for last semester. And the idea was, how could we work together in a co-teaching situation? And now that sounds really a bit ironic. Go ahead.
Dr. Mitchell is bilingual, Spanish focused.
There's a green light.
Should be on. And I do math methods. So the big issue was that my math methods courses are taught in English, but we have a large number of bilingual ed going for bilingual certifications who are bilingual in Spanish and English, and some of them are first language Spanish speakers. So how could we help bridge that language thing in the context of math?
Well, there were even more issues. I'm not really very good in math. And when we started talking about co-teaching, I was like, I'm going to co-teach in math? So there were a lot of things to talk about in this co-teaching situation. And but Dr. Sack kept talking about the piece that she kept pushing was the language piece. And it wasn't that we needed to teach in Spanish or we needed to teach in English. It that she kept pushing that we needed to really be able to think about concepts, not only math, but concepts in our first language. So go ahead and talk some more.
And also the formal language in both languages was important. I think that was a big piece as well. So one of the things we definitely allowed was that our students had the option of doing any assignments, whether they were written or oral presentations. They could do them in either language. So fortunately, Dr. Mitchell was there to help me grade the ones that were in Spanish, because my Spanish isn't as good as, it's about as good as her math, I think.
My math got a little bit better. So we identified a couple of areas that we wanted to focus on, and one of the main areas we wanted to look at was math identity. And what we know in EC through 6, all of our students are going to teach math. We do know that when they go out into the schools, now there's a lot more departmentalization. And so, but all students need to be ready to teach math. But if you ask students, they'll say, I don't like math. I don't want to teach math. I want to teach reading. I love reading. And if you ask Dr. Van Horn, they will tell you how much they love reading. And so we decided to explore the math identity piece. And we did that through some couple of pieces that we use in literacy. And one was we did a cluster write, and we did a pre and post of their math identity through a cluster write. And we had them just identify what do they think about math. And in the pre, we just kind of hit them with it first off, and some of them didn't even want to walk into the classroom. They had this sense of, I don't like math, I don't want to come into this classroom. And then we talked about the math identity, and then we talked about then Dr. Sack did her magic, and what this class has been about, that she and Dr. Connell have done in their curriculum, and worked on a lot of things, and I'll let her talk about it in a minute. And then we did a post to look at if there was change in their math identity. And we have some of those that we can show tonight of their cluster rights that they came up with. And it hasn't changed. We didn't work miracles, but we did have some that started looking at, if I really look at my math identity, there are some ways that I can shift my attitude toward math.
So one of the things that we struggle with is that almost everyone has had the kind of math instruction where the instructor stands at the board and you copy everything down and you do the homework and you're on your own. And that is totally teacher-centered, not at all what we want them to do. So one of the things that they were able to engage in was lots of group work. They were able to engage with problem solving with their peers, talk about it with their peers, hear different perspectives about particular problems across the class. So they got to see these ways of doing things in so many different ways. And some of them even commented that, where they were so scared to have to show what they didn't know, they now had the comfort of the group to support them, and realized that there were lots of other people feeling the same, but because they did things in groups, they made much more sense of everything, and they were able to accomplish what I wanted them to do. And this is all modeling how I want them to ultimately teach. And they liked being able to use whatever language. And what was also nice, we had English speakers in the class as well, who are getting their teaching certificate as English speakers, but also have to get an English as a second language piece, because they will have second language learners down the road when they teach. So they got to hear presentations in Spanish, even if Spanish was absolutely not a language that they had any part of, but it gave them the feeling of what it's like to be in a classroom where you're having to make sense of a language that is not your own. So that, the empathy of that when they become teachers themselves.
Right. So we had language choice, so they could choose what language they wanted to present in for their different projects that they did. That also gave the students that were English language learners that English was not their first language, but Spanish also wasn't their language. That gave them opportunity to think about, well, what is it I think first in? Because I would ask them many times, so how do you process math? Do you process math in your first language, or do you process math in English? And many of them had to go, I don't know. Let me think about that. And so I would have to tell them, okay, so if you as an adult, you're very successful sitting here at this level, you have to think about that. How do you think a second grader has to process that too? And you get, you're having a choice. You get a choice to do that. What about a second grader who might not get that choice to have that opportunity? So we had a lot of opportunities there to talk about language and choice and what would you prefer to do in terms of processing math concepts. And that's what Dr. Sack really opened up, was which is the best way for you to process some of these difficult concepts that you might have barriers to, not because you can't do it, but because somewhere somebody has told you or made you feel bad about yourself because of either some reason you don't like math for some reason, and now you have started you have negative feelings toward it. So it was really quite an interesting experience.
Yes, and we also asked them, we had them process certain problems, and we said, on your own, but this time, instead of working with the group that you usually work with, we want you to go work with someone on the other side of the room. So they were now exposed to working with a different group. And there was a nice discussion about, you process in your own language, but you now have to explain in a different language, and how does that feel? And how can you help your future students deal with that? So basically it was a very successful course. We no longer had those students dreading to come in the door. They couldn't wait for the class. And right at the end we had focus groups, small group, about 6 people per group. So they had a chance to really open out. So share what that.
So we put them into focus groups and invited them to come. And we did it we say invited, but they were required to come for a grade. So we did focus groups, and we put open-ended questions, and we asked them to respond in the groups. We wanted to do it as in groups instead of individual interviews. And we asked some questions about how has this semester helped you, and I have a list of the questions if you're interested in seeing some of the questions. And the reason why I like to do focus groups versus an individual interview is when they're individual, they may not think of good responses, or they may forget to answer, or they're nervous. But if they're in groups, they may hear somebody else respond, and then that helps them. They piggyback off of each other's answers and go, oh yeah, and then I remember, oh yeah. And so we were able to get feedback from them about the semester, because we wanted to know, was this helpful? Did this type of learning process help you? And so we really did get some good feedback from them. And that's where we were getting the pieces about the language. It was their first time to really have to process their language and the math, the concepts of the math and the language. And it was their first time to really go, oh, this is important. And so those were things that were important to them.
Yeah, we had a hard time keeping them, we had a hard time when the time was up, because the next group was coming in. They really wanted to keep talking about how positive the experience was. And they really appreciated it. And I do have to add that Dr. Mitchell kept helping with formal mathematical terms, and just being real particular about those in both languages and the importance of those things. And they had a great time. They really appreciated it. We wish we could continue to do this, but I guess there's a funding issue.
I was just going to ask you if you were, and if anyone had any questions. I think we need to work on that. It sounds like it was an amazing experience. Maybe you could come meet with me. We can take a look at some of your data. Seems like something you're going to write about and
Definitely
incorporate into the program.
Definitely that. I think so. And Dr. Canales asked me maybe to consider doing the same thing in his class, which is a wonderful invitation. And I do think that this is something that we should consider and how we could pair our classes with bilingual and ESL. I really wish we could see a way to do that.
Well, I've seen that in Read 3306, and I know the benefit of that kind of exchange, but mathematics, this is phenomenal. Does anyone, let's give them a hand.
Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask?
Was anyone here a part of that?
Yeah, I was looking around. It didn't see. I know y'all are PD2s, but we didn't see y'all are in the
It's
evening.
great to
right?
have you here. Good to have you here. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just.
It's me. Yeah, now you gotta
Bye,
go
Dr.
teach.
Sack.
So next we have Angie Goins.
Hi, my name is Angela Goins. I'm a lecturer of social work in the social work program here, which is under the College of Public Service. I'd like to thank Stephen Villano for facilitating these symposiums. This is the first of its kind where we present how we used our either Curriculum Innovative Award or a Scholarly Innovative Award. And I also want to deeply thank Dean Van Horn, because if it wasn't for her vision, we wouldn't have these funds in order to do these research projects that we're talking to you tonight about. So thank you both so much for allowing us this venue to do this. Thank you. I'm going to talk about the opposite end of the spectrum that Laura and Jackie were talking about, working with students who are going to be working with children, elementary level. I'm a geriatric social worker. This year I celebrate being a geriatric social worker, a licensed social worker in the state of Texas for 23 years. And so the bulk of my experience comes from practice. What I used my Scholarly Innovative Award for was practice-informed research. We talk about research-informed practice all the time, but I'm about to graduate with my doctor in social work, a DSW in May. And there's two types of doctorates in social work. One's the PhD, which Heather has, my colleague here, and then there's the doctorate of social work. And when I was trying to decide which one was a better fit for me, coming from 20 plus years of experience or practice experience, I found it was a good fit. But I also wanted to teach in higher education. That was very important to me. So I chose a program that had education as practice. In other words, teaching is a form of social work practice. So I could continue teaching and learn what I learned in the field. And so I started here full-time as a lecturer after 20 plus years in practice. And something that always amazed me was, like, in the next 3 years, 1/5 of our population will be nothing but older adults. And it always mystified me that not more social workers went into it. And then when I started teaching, it mystified me why aren't students interested in going into geriatrics? So I was sitting there trying to come up with, what am I going to write for my dissertation 3 years ago? And here I had access. My program is through St. Catherine's and the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we had access to the archive library. And since the focus is education as practice, I thought, okay, let's go back in time and see, at what point did the social work history or social work education see a need to start reaching out to maybe students who were interested in geriatrics? And what I found was that the community, more than education, wanted there to be a focus on geriatrics because they were seeing a need with older adults in the community, and nobody was doing anything about it. So they reached out to social work education. And so I started thinking, okay, I'm going to look at the archives and find out why there isn't more attention given to geriatrics. And what I found was amazing. And it made up the first part of my dissertation, which is geriatric social work education from early prospects to future prospects. How are we going to work with other disciplines to get to have enough people, you know, with the knowledge and skills to work with the elderly population? And so I wrote my paper. It was archived. It was a historical analysis. And for students who are interested in doing research, this is a great way to learn and to do research. And so what I did is I found out that there were all kinds of reasons why people didn't want to go into it. And so like 25, 30 pages later, you know, writing this article, I really, I was fascinated with, you know, the different groups that were interested in having students learn about geriatric. It was the community, it was the federal government, it was public welfare agencies. It's not that the Council of Social Work Education in the country didn't want to teach about geriatrics, they just didn't know how to go about it. And so, so this article or this manuscript that I wrote got accepted for publication last month. And the way I used my Scholarly Innovative Award was we as faculty get professional development money, and that we use that to go to social work conferences and to help us kind of fine-tune our teaching. But there's not extra money to do anything else outside of that. And so I submitted a proposal to present this paper about geriatric social work education and the importance of it to the University of California in Berkeley. They had a conference on aging and society, and they accepted my proposal to present my presentation. Well, I was like, oh, I need airfare, and I need money to do that, and who's going to help me with that? And so, and about that time, Dean Van Horn had instituted this, and I applied for one of the first ones, and I received it. So if it wasn't for this award, I wouldn't have been able to present my own research at this conference. And what was exciting was an international conference, and I'm going to read just a few of the workshop survey, because you know how you think about something in your head? You know, in my program, they teach us to be practice scholars, to take things that we learn in practice and to research them and to add new knowledge. And since this is your dissertation, you have to add new knowledge. So some of the feedback from some of the attendees that went to my workshop, I got an insight into how geriatric social work education has been changing so far in the American context. I really enjoyed hearing something about the history of geriatric social work in the U.S. Good historical facts. This is a very rich literature. I like to read the article from this study. So here, as a representative of UofHD, I took my scholarship, and people from all around the world were interested in knowing about it. Something that I came up with on a July of 2015 interested people around the world. And this conference, if I hadn't gone to the conference, I wouldn't have the opportunity to submit my paper, which they accepted for their journal, which is the Journal of Aging and Social Change. And just to show that, you know, something that you may not think may be interesting to others is interesting to others, I just wanted to read a few comments from the 2 peer reviewers that reviewed my article. And I say all this to inspire you as a student, because I'm a student too right now, until I graduate, that you can do anything that you set your mind to. And so I really want to inspire you that something that you come up with one day can be presented. They said, well-researched, documented, so great to see the original sources. We need more historical analysis in social work. This article will make a significant contribution to the field. The historical approach is refreshing and inspiring. I hope to be able to use the article in my gerontology courses and core courses that address the development of the profession. The article makes an original contribution to knowledge, examining older texts to decide what this means for the future of social work. So something that I didn't think was going to be important to anyone is being published now. And so I say all that to say, you know, use opportunities to work with your professors if they ask you to work on some research. Don't be afraid of research. It makes the world turn. And you can take something, if you are a practitioner, you can take something you learn from practice and research and see how you can share that. Or you can research something and you can bring it to a point to where you can share it with individuals. I think what touches me on a personal level is that something that I've seen for 20-something years in practice is going to be in print, but also that I represent U of HD. I don't just represent Angela Goins. I represent this university. So they know that U of HD is doing something great and talking about aging issues. And so that's how we educate one another, and that's how we keep the wealth of research and knowledge going. And they see that we have innovative ways of teaching our students. And so that's really all I have to say. Is there any questions? Okay.
Done.
Thank you so much.
I just want to say thank you for sharing that, and thank you for reading that. I think that that's something that we need to have, and it's very affirming to hear you say that journey that you took to do that, because I just think it's really important, and it's important for us to do that. And I hope that some of you heard the process, because if you just heard the pieces or just saw the pieces, you might not know or the pieces of the puzzle that come together. But thank you for sharing that, because I think it's really important for all of us to hear it.
Thank you for the money to present in Berkeley. Because you take that feedback and you go, okay, I'm gonna, because there was some constructive criticism in there, and I took that back and I incorporated it in my article before I sent the final product. So, keep your mind open and just accept that criticism. It really helps.
Hello. Oh, I have a teacher voice, so I don't know if I'll need the mic. I have a dad voice too. I can call people by their first and last names, and then you know it's serious. Hi, I'm Dr. Allaire, and first of all, again, I want to thank Stephen Villano for this opportunity, and Dean Van Horn for the vision to set up the committee. And right now, I actually happen to be serving as the chair, of the Curricular Innovation Award and Scholarly Innovation Award Committee. So you're welcome. No, but in all seriousness, it's not to pat myself on the back or toot my own horn or anything like that. It's absolutely inspiring to get the applications from faculty members throughout the College of Public Service, to see what your colleagues are working on, to see the ideas that they have, that they want to implement in the classroom, or the research that they want to do. And maybe it's a pilot study, maybe it's an idea that's been percolating around in their brain for a while, maybe it's something that's just not to the point where they're ready for a larger university grant or an outside grant. It's really a privilege and an honor to kind of read through everything that's in the beginning stages and provide support, and sometimes some constructive criticism and feedback to your colleagues to help them create a better product, whatever it is that they're doing. And I just want to talk briefly about what I'm doing. I managed to, I know it's kind of weird, I'm the chair of the committee. Yes, I managed to get an award for scholarly innovation. I did not review my own application. No, I did not. So this, I got an award for some research that I'm doing that's actually a longitudinal study, looking at our students here at UHD, and in part how they are perceiving their college university experience, but then also more specifically, especially for urban education, is how they develop their teacher identity. We spend a lot of time talking about practice, talking about methods of teaching, and everything like that. How are students developing and starting to internalize that idea that they are becoming teachers? And that's what I really wanted to do. We do surveys, we do course evaluations, we do a graduation survey, and we go back at least within the first 3 years of teaching to try to get feedback from our graduates about teaching. But these were just little snapshots that we're getting. And I really wanted to look at something, like I said, longitudinally. So I'm starting this year with freshmen, and I'm going to be working with them, hopefully, They always have the option to back out, but I'll be working with them hopefully all the way through graduation in 4, possibly 5 years, just depending on how they do at university. So it's sort of a two-part. So last semester, we had our first round of in-depth interviews. So I hesitate to use the word mixed methods because I won't get into that because I'll be here for another hour. But there's the bulk of the data is through in-depth interviews with each of these students. And I have 12 students that I'm working with currently who are, as I said, are freshmen. They're here at UHD. They have self-selected themselves by saying that they are interested in becoming teachers. So we sit down and we talk. I have an interview protocol that I use to try to keep everything along the same lines. But then there's also a survey portion using what's called an academic emotions questionnaire, which is a very big, something like 230 statement questionnaire. But what it does is it looks at the emotions that the students are experiencing, things like pride, hopelessness, anger, and other such emotions that have to do with, that are class related, that are test related, that are study related. So on the one hand, it's going to be very interesting interviewing students, hopefully once a semester, all along the way from freshman year to graduation. But then also with this survey instrument, it's also typically used as a one-off kind of a thing. So it's going to be really interesting to see how things like their anxiety changes over time, or how their pride or other discrete emotions, happiness, anger, fear, change or stay the same over their entire college career. I'd love to share some of the themes with you, but they're still in the process of emerging. One big theme that came out from last semester, surprise, surprise, was Hurricane Harvey. So, I mean, aside from the Astros winning the World Series, that was pretty much the big emotional event for all of Houston. So that was definitely a big theme that came out, especially for the freshmen, because they had the 1 week, their first week of college ever, and then we were off for a week because of the hurricane. And knock on wood, none of the freshmen were personally impacted by the hurricane, but it definitely threw them for a loop. It definitely increased their anxiety and uncertainty. They weren't sure what was happening. They weren't sure what to do. Some of them got really frustrated because they were trying to still turn in assignments during the hurricane, and then of course Blackboard went down, so then they really didn't know what to do. And then they get back and they're thinking, oh my gosh, I have all of this work that I need to do. Just like all of us, trying to deal with the aftermath of the hurricane and deal with the semester. But at the same time, there were also some positives that came out of the experience. One of which was a lot of the students that I talked with had a greater sense of community, especially here at the university. They volunteered with clubs a little bit more often. They made donations to food drives, to clothing drives, raising money to help their fellow students. And some of them even commented that they felt not really more of an obligation, but they felt like they were more likely to donate to UHD-related organizations because they knew that it was going to support their fellow students, as opposed to other community organizations and even churches, where they still donated and volunteered, but they felt like, well, if I donate to those organizations, I don't really know who they're helping. But I know that if I donate food or clothing or time or money to a club at UHD, it's going to be helping, or could be helping, the student that's sitting next to me in my English class or in my math class. And that was a pretty powerful moment for a lot of the students. So I'm excited. I'm hopeful that I get to work with these students throughout their college careers, and that's my spiel.
I was just
Except for Dean Van Horn.
I was just thinking while you were talking, the survey with the hundreds of questions, 283 questions, it seems like even though your focus is on the development of teacher identity and as teachers, you're going to learn a lot about what the college experience for UHD students in general is.
Oh, definitely.
I think
Definitely.
that's going to be of generalized value for us.
Well, this is, and again, I hesitate to, like I said, call it mixed methods because, you know, with quantitative kinds of things, that you usually want hundreds, if not thousands of survey results. This is going to be 12. So for a quantitative person, they're going to look at it and go, 12, well, that's ridiculous. It doesn't tell us anything. But it does open a window into the college experience and the perception that students are having about things. You know, but you can't separate the two at this point because all of these students, they're not taking teacher preparation classes. They're taking their general core classes at this point. So while we still talk about teaching and teacher identity, especially now that we're getting to the end of their freshman year, they're looking at sophomore year where they can start taking some pre-PD classes. So they're starting to think about that a little bit more. But a lot of the reflection has been about the overall university experience right now. And that was one of the reasons, the things that brought this project about. Because when our department, the Urban Ed department, we were doing CAPE accreditation, and these are data, this is data that we don't really have. And that partially inspired me to do this so that we can kind of look at this data and see what we're getting, and then, you know, really take an unfiltered look at whether we're doing a good job as a department, but then also as a university for at least this particular group of students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So hi everybody, my name is Heather Goltz. I'm an associate professor of social work in the Department of Criminal Justice and Social Work. And you know, I love coming to forums like this because it's an opportunity for my colleagues and I to actually, you know, sit and talk about, you know, some things that are near and dear to us. I mean, you know, I think the average student thinks we just sit around and just, you know, we spit formulas at each other like E equals MC squared and Y equals MX plus B. And that's the language of how we talk with each other. But usually we get together and we just talk about, well, how was your day? And wow, I had a great burger. You know, those kinds of things. So it's great to hear the kind of work that my colleagues are doing. I greatly benefited from the SIA funding last year. I had a wonderful opportunity to present at a conference I had not attended since I was a postdoc with the VA and Baylor College of Medicine. So it had been several years since I connected with colleagues at the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality meeting. Okay, that's a mouthful. We just call it Quad S for short. And it is one of the only professional organizations in the nation dedicated to scientific sexual health, sexuality research. And so it was really important for me to reconnect because my old office mate at Texas A&M from my doctoral program was being inducted as the president that year. And I got a chance to cross a bucket list item. Okay, this is how you're going to know I'm a nerd. Dr. Jocelyn Elders, our former Surgeon General, was the opening keynote at the Quad S meeting. And I was like, finally, I get to see her speak. This is a woman who, when I was a child, influenced my desire to go into health research. I mean, I was like, I don't know, this high, so not that much shorter than I am now. When she was the Surgeon General under Bill Clinton as president, and then they had the infamous M word said in an interview, masturbation, and she was fired. You know, in terms of using this word in the context of talking about, positive sexuality and disease and pregnancy prevention, and she lost her job for saying something in the 90s that we just say in common on the streets now. Different time, different context. And so here's my hero. She's giving the opening keynote. I just had to be there. So I put in abstracts related to some of the work that I do, related to reproductive and gynecological cancers on one hand, and also genitourinary cancers on the other. So all below the belt mostly, cancers that have implications for sexual health. So I was like, oh my gosh, I have 2 abstracts, 2 shots to get this work that I'm doing seen on a national stage. And then I got very lucky, and they were both accepted. And it was like, oh man, it's too late to back out now, and I don't have any money. So what do I do? And then I saw the application, the advertisement for the Scholarly Innovation Award grant applications, and I went, ooh, there's internal college money. The college is willing to invest in not just the research process, but also the dissemination of those research findings. Bless you. And so I applied, and I got great feedback, and I was very fortunate to be funded to go to the Quad-S meeting, where I was able to reconnect with folks in my field. I hadn't, of course, we spoke on the telephone or via email, but we hadn't seen each other in years. So one presentation was, kind of that conference was a tale of 2 different types of research. There was a qualitative study, a small qualitative study of bladder cancer survivors, and I presented qualitative findings from a case study that came from that small bladder cancer study. And the importance of those findings, we are in a moment in time in terms of oncology and social work and so many other facets of our society, where we talk about what it means to have an intersection of identities. And some of my research crosses over into oncology, specifically with gender and sexual minorities. And this particular presentation was basically a case study about the lived experiences of a woman impacted by bladder cancer who happened to be a member, of a sexual minority. And what was it like for her? And in interviewing her, it was very clear that her experience was so much different than her heterosexual female counterparts in terms of available social support, in terms of access to care, in terms of her resources. She talked about having to put her house on the market because she didn't have any income. She was a relatively young woman for bladder cancer survivors. She was in her 50s. Believe me, that actually is young for bladder cancer. And she talked about how she was very dependent on assistance from a local nonprofit organization who served women who identify as lesbian or bisexual or trans. And that is how she was able to navigate the aftermath of this horrific cancer diagnosis and treatment story. And that was so much different than the other narratives from the heterosexually identified women on the study who were married or widowed. If our woman on the study who was a widow, she had adult children, and they had sufficient resources to be able to help her in terms of supporting herself and getting the home health and to take care of her home and those kinds of things. But here was this woman who was ostensibly single, never married, professional, well-educated, but didn't have a source of income because she had to quit her job because she couldn't work, recovering from multiple bladder cancer surgeries. And it just, while the other women were talking about spending time with their children or their hobbies or many of the other things that we commonly talk about, even in the midst of complex diseases, this one woman, you know, kind of was this exemplar for a whole group of people who experienced many challenges in terms of social support and financial resources and navigating changes in body image and how do you get back into society and into relationships post-cancer. So it was just a fascinating case study and a way to open conversation about how we welcome folks who often, you know, may look like us, but who may have very substantial differences in identity. So that was the first study. The second study was a big database study related to Pap screening for cervical cancer. Several years ago, the U.S. Public Health Service Task Force made changes to the way that we screen for cervical cancer. Now follow me on this because it's really important that we think about how we brand access to care and health messages. So you have many generations of women who have been told faithfully, every year, maybe you plan it around your birthday or another important anniversary, you go get your Pap. Whole generations. That is, if you don't get any other care. So if you're a woman who's just given birth, chances are you are going to very consistently get medical care because you've given birth and you're doing follow-up. But there's no other type of branding of access to care like that other than Pap screening with women. Women who are not new mothers rely heavily, especially if they are lower socioeconomic status, rely heavily on those Pap screens for getting not just screened for cervical cancer, but also sexually transmitted infections, HIV, perhaps diabetes or other health concerns. That may be their one point of contact in any given year. So when the U.S. Public Health Service Task Force changed their guidelines related to when women are screened for cervical cancer, there was actually a major shift that accompanied that in how women, especially if they don't have primary care physicians, how women then receive their health care. And yet, we have no information on what the implications of that change are. The change was suggested on the best available scientific evidence in the research literature. It was open to public commentary. Commentary was taken into account, and then the guidelines changed. Now, up until that time, the U.S., in terms of cervical cancer didn't even really crack the top 15 or so of cancers in the U.S., whereas it occupies number 4 globally in women outside the U.S. Okay? And that was a direct result of all of the public service, the public health service efforts that went into get your Pap once a year, get screened once a year. Oh, and there's this other constellation of other health services that come along with getting that Pap done. And yet now we've decoupled. We've decoupled that. And so now women are told that if you're not in a high-risk category, regardless of whether you're sexually active or not. And there's a few qualifiers there, but you pretty much don't have to screen after a certain age. So the study was a database study from a healthy aging survey with several hundred women, older, middle-aged and older women as a subset of that database study in terms of their PAP screening practices. And because we were very concerned. Basically, there was a lot of cervical cancer research up until the guidelines changed in the US, and then it's been very quiet. In fact, most of the studies I identified in the time period since the guidelines changed and present day are done in other countries. So we have no idea on a population health level, in a health services level, what the implications of these guideline changes are for millions of women. And the hammer, we thought, we wanted to investigate, would this more heavily impact women who traditionally benefited from these types of screenings through Medicaid, Medicare, et cetera, if they didn't have private insurance. And sure enough, what we found is the women who had lower educational attainment, lower socioeconomic status, really were not participating in the PAP screening in ways that women who had higher resources, higher educational attainment do. And then there were some differences along traditional lines. Traditionally, in terms of cervical cancer, the hammer falls harder on women who are Hispanic or Latino or identify as African American. So what we have now found is the brewing of the perfect storm of a public health nightmare. And we are doing no research related to this issue. And so really we wanted to present this data at this conference to open up the conversation. Here we have Jocelyn Elders, the opening keynote, and to talk with our colleagues who are reproductive and sexual health researchers, ostensibly, and open up the discussion about why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we studying this? You know, and so interestingly enough, while I was in Atlanta at the Quad-S conference, the guidelines are up for public discussion again, and they're going to be tweaked. And it looks like there are some changes that are going to be made. I mean, that's not a result of our presentation. I wish it were, but then that helps us to then now go, okay, here are the tweaks to the guidelines. Let's have a conversation. Let's do the research and see who is impacted, how they're being impacted, and how do we change health communication and health education messages and target them to different subgroups of folks who are engaging in PAP screening and aren't, so that we can make sure that those who may be at higher risk can have that early detection. Why is it not being talked about? Well, I can tell you, from a personal perspective, I was that one a year myself. Those aren't comfortable. If you can avoid it, you do. So on the public side, if your government has said, we have evidence-based guidelines that say, if you meet these criteria, and the criteria are very broad, by the way, then you no longer have to have screening. Then most of the women I knew personally, even those who are health educators and social workers, went, yay, I don't have to do that again. From a professional perspective and in looking at health services, there is a reason why they changed the guidelines. I don't mean to poo-poo what the U.S. Public Health Service Task Force did. There actually is a risk, a health risk, to having PAP screening done, especially if you screen positive for having cervical changes, because you may have the cervix removed. You may have partial removal of the cervix. There are health consequences that can come from that early detection of human papillomavirus-induced cervical cancer, when the human body actually can, in some cases, clear human papillomavirus, meaning we can, our body, our immune system can fight and not develop cervical cancers in certain cases. And so the risk to the woman for future reproduction or sexual function, or there's other consequences of prematurely removing or partially removing that cervix. And so, not necessarily, because it's virus. And you can actually not just develop cervical cancer from HPV, you actually can get it in your throat, your mouth, and other places too. But in terms of cervical, it's the treatment, and then you go on a monitoring regimen. At least that's how it was. We don't even have really good ideas of how that monitoring regimen will go, because fewer women are getting screened. So there's this cascade effect. I understand the cost-benefit ratio, the risk analysis that was done, the potential harm to the body, to the cervix, from these very invasive treatments of cervical cancer. But I think the pendulum may have swung a little bit too far in the opposite direction, based on the evidence we do have in the literature, and particularly when there are very clear socioeconomic status related and racial and ethnic disparities related to who does get screened, that are longstanding, well-researched. So though that's a tale of two kind of presentations that were that I was able to do as a direct result of the the SIA funding, really to open up conversation with other practitioners and researchers related to cultural competence, related to sexual and gender minorities, and also kind of this this sense of understanding and educating and being culturally aware of the socioeconomic and other type factors that then influence who gets screened for this other cancer. And so one of the reasons why I am not producing data related to that is because we actually have both manuscripts in process right now, and within the next month we are going to be submitting them. And just so you know, in the acknowledgement section, we will acknowledge the SIA funding from the UHD College of Public Service as being instrumental in facilitating the work that contributed to these two manuscripts and the research. So thank you very much for the funding.
So that's awesome.
Wasn't it? Just wanted to make a little word thing for you. So I just pulled out ideas as you talked, because to me, this is one of my. These events are probably one of my favorite things that we do. It's just to sit together and to see the meaning of the lives that are inside this building and the connections. So I just put together some words that I think kind of represent what we said. Innovating with internal initiatives, confronting fears, exploring archives, new ways to teach, to learn, to be together, questioning identity, intersectionality, findings, opportunities, revealing research, available support, reflecting, looking closer, breaking ground, and fusing energy, because I think that's what these opportunities do, and that's what we do for each other, all of us. So Thank you, and thank you for filming it so I could just watch it again.